I came home hours earlier than planned, expecting a quiet evening. Instead, I walked into a moment so cruel that it shattered everything I believed about my family. I never imagined betrayal could wear such a familiar face. My name is Ayoka Redfeather, and I work as a wildlife photographer in Arizona. I've spent years trusting the people I loved most. That night, I learned trust can disappear in seconds. The desert sun had dipped low behind the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange as I pulled my truck into the driveway. My assignment in the Superstition Mountains had wrapped up 2 days ahead of schedule, and all I could think about was the warm comfort of home. I had imagined a quiet dinner with my husband, Mark, and my sister, Kaylin, who had been staying with us to help while I was away. I didn't want to call ahead. The idea of a genuine, unscripted surprise was the only thing fueling me after a week of sleeping in a dusty tent. As I stepped onto the porch, the silence of the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual, but I figured they were just preoccupied. I walked inside, my camera bag heavy on my shoulder, expecting the familiar hum of the television or the clatter of plates. Instead, the house was eerily still. I set my keys on the foyer table, my heart light and expectant, oblivious to the fact that the atmosphere was charged with a tension that didn't belong in my sanctuary. Then, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound coming from the living room, the sound of low, hushed laughter. It wasn't the kind of laughter shared between siblings or friends. It was intimate, punctuated by the sharp intake of breath that signaled a secret conversation. I froze in the hallway, the air suddenly turning frigid in my lungs. My pulse began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct I had honed as a photographer, trained to notice the smallest shift in the wild, screamed at me to turn around and walk back out into the night. I took a tentative step toward the living room threshold. The edge of the doorframe acted as a barrier between the life I knew and the reality waiting to destroy it. I leaned slightly, my gaze cutting into the dim light of the room. What I saw wasn't grand or cinematic. It was mundane and therefore infinitely more painful. Mark was standing by the fireplace, his hand resting on the small of Kaylin's back. She was laughing, looking up at him with a gaze that I recognized all too well. It was the look of possession. She tilted her head, and he leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. The world didn't just stop. It fractured. I felt a dizzying wave of nausea wash over me, the kind that makes the room tilt on its axis. My brain struggled to process the visual information, frantically trying to rewrite the scene into something innocent, but the truth was stubborn. They were standing in my home, in the space where I had shared my dreams, my fears, and my love, behaving as if I were a ghost who didn't exist. My grip tightened on the strap of my bag, the leather digging into my shoulder, but I couldn't move. I felt every drop of warmth drain from my limbs, leaving me hollowed out, a shell standing in the dark. The betrayal hit me not as a singular blow, but as a slow, creeping realization that the people I had been protecting were the ones stripping me bare. It wasn't just Mark. It was Kaylin, my own flesh and blood, the sister I had sheltered when she had nowhere else to go. The anger flared up, hot and blinding, but it was quickly eclipsed by a crushing confusion. Why? How long had this been going on under my roof, right under my nose while I was out capturing the beauty of the natural world, failing to see the rot spreading through my own? I wanted to scream, to break the silence and shatter their little bubble, but my throat was tight, choked by the sheer magnitude of the hurt. They were still talking, their voices low, weaving a web of lies that I was suddenly forced to witness. Kaylin reached out to adjust Mark's collar, her fingers lingering in a way that made my skin crawl. It was an act of intimacy that signaled a long-standing familiarity. They hadn't just met. They had been nurturing this under the cover of my absence, probably mocking me while I was miles away, working to build a future that they were actively dismantling. I realized with terrifying clarity that I was the only one playing by the rules of this marriage and this family. I silently backed away, my movements careful and robotic. I didn't want to confront them while I was this broken. I turned and slipped out the front door, the cool night air biting at my skin as I retreated into the dark, my tears finally spilling over. The next morning, The house was filled with a tension so thick it felt like I was walking through water. I sat at the breakfast table, my eyes burning from a sleepless night of replaying the scene in my head. Kaylin sat across from me, her usual chipper self, pouring coffee with an ease that made my stomach turn. She looked at me, her smile bright and practiced, and asked how my trip was. It was a masterpiece of deceit. I couldn't take it anymore. I set my mug down, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I came home early last night, Kaylin," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a hammer. She paused, the spoon hovering over her cup. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, before they hardened into a mask of confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone dripping with fake concern. I laid out what I saw, the fireplace, the touch, the laughter. She didn't break. Instead, she laughed, a dry, dismissive sound that hit me harder than a scream. She told me I was tired, that I was imagining things because of the stress of my work. She turned it around, framing me as the paranoid, overworked victim of my own imagination. When I tried to speak to my parents about it later, the isolation became absolute. Kaylin had been spending time with them while I was away, poisoning the well. She had already painted me as distant, difficult, and prone to episodes. When I confronted Mark, he looked at me with cold, detached eyes, telling me I needed help. He took her side with a calmness that was more terrifying than rage. It became clear that I was the enemy in my own family, the outsider looking in at a coalition built on my own misfortune. The days that followed were a blur of manipulation. Kaylin became the center of the family dynamic, constantly calling my parents to vent about my unreasonable behavior. She whispered to our cousins that I was jealous of her, that I was losing my grip. I watched as the narrative shifted. My history, my years of hard work and loyalty, were being erased and replaced by a caricature of a woman who couldn't be trusted. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting a marriage, I was fighting an entire system they had built. Every time I tried to speak, I was silenced by their collective gaslighting, told that my eyes and my ears were lying to me. I decided to stop fighting them in the open. I retreated into a quiet, cold observation. I began to look at things I had previously ignored, the strange gaps in our bank account, the deleted text logs on the house tablet, the way Mark and Kaylin shared inside jokes that excluded me. I started keeping a private journal, meticulously documenting the timeline of their interactions. I discovered that their connection hadn't started a few weeks ago. It had been festering for months. I found digital traces of messages sent while I was at dinner, or even while I was in the other room. They were so confident in my submissiveness that they didn't even bother to hide their tracks very well. They were arrogant, and that was going to be their undoing. The realization of the depth of their planning hurt more than the initial discovery. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a campaign of deception. My heart felt like it was encased in ice, a cold, hard stone in the center of my chest. I stopped crying. I stopped wanting their apologies or their explanations. I realized that an apology would be just another lie, another layer of polish on their rotten foundation. I didn't want forgiveness. I wanted the truth to be the only thing standing when the dust settled. I promised myself, in the silence of my own heart, that they would suffer the consequences of what they had done. I wasn't going to be the victim who stayed quiet. I was going to be the architect of their exposure. I began the slow, methodical work of gathering my evidence. I took screenshots of every incriminating text, every suspicious bank transfer, and every digital footprint they had left behind. I reached out to an old friend from law school who had always kept my secrets, and she guided me through the legalities of what I could and couldn't use. We mapped it out, piece by piece. My friend, who had seen how much I had poured into this life, was my rock, the only person who didn't question my sanity. We planned for a night where the mask would be stripped away, not in a chaotic explosion, but in a controlled, surgical strike that would leave them with nowhere to hide. The night arrived. I invited my parents and my in-laws over, claiming I wanted to resolve everything that had been happening between us. Mark was hesitant, but the prospect of making me look like the unstable one in front of them all was too tempting. Kaylin arrived with that same smug practice smile. I sat them all in the living room, the air thick with anticipation. I started calmly, asking them about the timeline of their interactions, listening to the lies they spun with such ease. Kaylin insisted she was just a guest, just a sister helping out. Then, I opened my laptop and connected it to the television. I played the evidence, the transcripts, the financial records, the photos I'd taken. The silence that followed